Hi. Today we are going to look into the current status of genetic testing of rare movement disorders in India and the way forward. So in this talk, what we are going to do is just give an overall brief overview of what is genetic testing, how it has evolved over the years, and what is the current status of testing facilities available in India, and what can we look forward, especially from a point of view of movement disorders and rare movement disorders. So when we talk about rare disorders, what does this mean? The definitions vary across different geographical territories. For example, in Europe, any disorder which is affecting less than 50 people per every 100 per lakh population or 100,000 people, or in United States, if the overall population has less than 200,000 or less than 2 lakh citizens affected, is considered as rare disorders. If you look at from this perspective, there are about more than 7,000 disorders which can qualify as rare disorders and account for about almost 6 to 8% of the global population, which in turns out to be as about 300 million affected people around the world. Most of these disorders are genetical disorders, and most of them begin in childhood. So this is fair enough to understand about rare disorders, but how common are rare movement disorders? If you go by that list, the rare movement disorders are not so rare if you ask me. Among the rare movement disorders do form a big chunk, and this is the current available list of rare movement disorders, what you can see on the International Parkinson Disease and Movement Disorder Society of Movement Disorder Society. So, how genetic testing is playing a role? As we know that genetic disorders creates a major chunk of the diseases among these rare movement disorders. If you look into genetic testing has significantly evolved from 1950s, where only chromosomal analysis was available. Later on, with the development of Sanger sequencing in 1970s, then evolution to triplet repeat disorders, mitochondrial DNA variants evaluation, genomic imprinting, copy number variations, and multiple ligand-related assays. All these things changed in 1990s, and from 2000 onwards, with the evolution of the microarrays, and 2010 onwards, the next generation sequencing had dramatically changed the accessibility of genetic testing across the globe and ability to detect more and more genetic disorders, which are dramatically changing the whole picture of genetic disorders and rare disorders across the world. So when we tell about genetics, why and what is required, or what are we looking for that? Most of the time, what we are looking into is 4 different components here. This is just a broader perspective, the way I'm putting it forward here. So what are the genetic variants? What we look is, one is we look for single nucleotide variants where a single base pair is changed, or there may be indels or additions or removal of certain parts of the genes of varying between 1 to 50 base pairs. Or there could be a people who are having short tandem repeats where short nucleic acid sequences that are repeated for a certain stretch, what we commonly see within our ataxia disorders. Or there may be structural variants. Structural variants means these are a group of diverse genetic changes which are more than 50 base pair in size, that includes copy number variations, rearrangements, and mobile elements insertions. So basically, when we ask for a genetic testing, we are trying to look into one of these things to make a diagnosis. If any one of these things are there, the possibility of having an abnormality is picked up. How do we do it? Currently, if you look into genomic testing, there are different ways of testing are there, and each one of these testing have the certain advantages. They look into certain type of analysis which has their own advantages and disadvantages, which includes cost also. I'm not going to go into detail of these things, but just to name like karyotaping, FISH, MLPA, microarray, triplet prime PSR, southern blotting techniques, Sanger sequencing, exome sequencing, short read genome sequencing, long read genome sequencing, and optimal genome mapping. As you can see, we have written what each one of these type of tests are going to look into what type of abnormalities in genetic testing, and then what are their advantages and what are their disadvantages, and hence the cost what is involved down there. Not only these type of genetic testings are important, we also need to have studies to understand, because many times you would have seen a lot of VUS or variant of unknown significance comes up, and how to analyze those variant of unknown significance, whether they have any weightage, because all these testing have their own limitations. To identify our technologies for functional assessments of VUS, there are different types of assessments are available, such as RNA sequencing, metabolomics, proteomics, or lipidomics, which together can be clumped under omics studies, or methylation array studies, methylation sensitive MLPA studies, and multiplexed assays of variant effect. Each one of them look into different issues and what type of functional deficits or functional abnormalities these are causing. And this helps us to make us understand whether the given VUS is of importance or what those modifications have causing in the body. So these have their own advantages for understanding. For examples, if you take into proteomics, it's a sample when you look at it, functional readout of proteome that can be open or targeted. It looks into all the types of different proteins or protein formations in these type of samples which has been given. And this helps us to understand whether the given sample or given genetic mutation causes certain type of a abnormal accumulation or depletion of a given substance. And this is how this becomes more important. Now, after understanding how the genetic testing has evolved, what are the different types of genetic variants, what we look into it, what are the different types of testing we do it for clinical understanding, and how to understand functional assessment, how do we go about it? What is the standard assessment process for a rare disorder across the globe? Across the globe, there are four components for any genetic disorders, which includes for rare disorder. One is proper clinical consultation. A proper clinical consultation with high degree of suspicion and intent to work up is the primary point from which whole diagnosis is dependent upon. If the primary consultation is wrong, or that there is a poor degree of suspicion about a possible rare disorder, or there is intent is limited because of various other factors, then the whole assessment of a rare disorder is limited. Now, once you know this, what clinical consultation has to be done, then probably what sample has to be collected is also more important. Whether you want to go for a genetic testing, or whether you want to look for a blood sample for a tandem mass spectroscopy or a metabolomic studies. So these all will depend upon what is the clinical diagnosis has been suspected and what type of testing you do it. And then comes the laboratory testing. As I told you, there are different types of testings are available, and we need to know what we are asking for that and whether the lab is equipped to answer those questions and how the lab has human resources to interpret those results and give an answer to us. Finally, once those reports come back to us, it's also more important as a clinician or the clinical consultation to correlate those genetic, because sometimes you might have seen that they would have reported few of the things as VUS, or some of them may be considered. So whether the given genetic testing was appropriate, whether it gives a full answer for what you're looking for that, whether it matches with the clinical findings, what you're looking into it, and how much importance you need to give for those variants what has been known. So given those things, if you go through all these four steps, then possibly the possibility of picking up a rare disorders is more likely, and you'll have a much more concrete evidence to talk about whenever you diagnose these rare movement disorders. Now, with the whole background of these genetic disorders, how the diagnostic assessment for a standard rare disorders are done, what is the current status? What is the current status of genetic testing of rare movement disorders in India? I'm going to look into this into few perspectives. One of them is how the clinical services is available. Are the laboratories and testing facilities are available? How the logistical support is available, maybe cost, government regulations, etc. And research or analytics, how we are have a do we have a strength to analyze big rare families, technologies to interpret and the utility of US and the bioinformatics? What is all this fits into it? So let's go into each one of them point by point. So coming to clinical services, unlike many other countries, including Western and other countries, when you look into it, clinical services across India is much more easily accessible, where patients can reach out to their general practitioners or a specialist or a subspecialist or a specialty clinic. And most of the major cities across India have a well-established specialties and subspecialty clinics, even for movement disorders, what can be seen. The biggest advantage in the Indian context is ease of consultation, where patient can approach to a general practitioner to a subspecialty in a given day or a given day multiple consultations can happen. However, limitation has been there is because of chaotic of consultations by patients if diagnosis is not clinched in initial consults and wrong specialty consults. Sometimes patient end up in a wrong specialty and never there is a doubt of possible alternative diagnosis, and that's where they get stuck with that. So if you look in the general perspective, what I would like to tell you, when you compare at a global level, yes, specialty clinical services are available across India, and where only the degree of suspicion is the one which keeps the patient away from a proper diagnosis in most of these scenarios. Coming forward, how is the genetic testing lab scenarios in India? Probably all of you will agree there are quite a few genetic testing labs are available across India now. In last 1 decade or about 10 to 15 years, the picture has dramatically changed, and the cost of testing also have dramatically changed over this last decade. So there is no dearth of having genetic labs. Most of the major cities or most of the major centers across India there are private labs and the government funded labs or a smaller genetic labs are available where specific type of testings are available. So what is the cost of testing in India? So I'm going to look at what type of testings are available and what is the cost for that. So when I reached out to a lab to find out what type of testings are available, I am myself was surprised because some of them I thought may not be available in India. If you look into it, most of the genetic testing are available in India. It may be karyotaping, FISH, MLPA, microarray, triplet prime PCR, southern blotting, Sanger sequencing, exome sequencing, short read genome sequencing, long read genome sequencing, optical genome mapping, everything is available. Some of them may be used only by the labs for certain research or academic purposes, but in a general perspective, all these testings are available and cost vary as per the test, which I have noted it down. Even for when you look for functional assays, RNA sequencing is available. Metabolomic studies are available for a limited number of studies. But there is a limitation there is currently not clearly availability of proteomics and lipidomics. Methylation sensitive MLPS and methylation array testing is also available. So if you look in a general perspective, the genetic testing labs and the support system in a broader perspective is very well established. Only his abilities, possibly the cost, which is variable. But however, when you look into the average testing, what it goes into rare movement disorders, these costs are within acceptable ranges for patients with rare movement disorders. But what barriers we have? Because we now know that consultation services are available, genetic labs and testing facilities are available. Primarily, what I could understand is there are three barriers. One is clinical care, second is cost, third is functional assessment studies. The clinical care, the limitations come is reaching out to the right specialty for consultation or referral for the right specialty for workup, degree of suspicion, and intent to make a diagnosis. This is where the limitation of clinical care comes into it. Second is cost. Many times, most of the patients would have been told that we are sending for genetic testing and you'll get an answer, and that's the last test. However, it's not a single test. That's what we need to get. Sometimes we do a single test analysis. It may end up that we need to do an extra extended analysis. It can be a parents and samples assess evaluation is required, or there may be leading to go from a single different type of from exome sequencing to a PCR triplet assess can need to be done, or this type of different Sanger sequencing is required. So these will add up to the cost. Sometimes these are not discussed with the patient when the initial testing is planned. So knowing these things helps us to discuss with the patients what is the cost and what are the additional costs planned for this. And yes, many times we may stumble upon interesting VUS and we require to prove that whether those VUS are of importance and whether they are pathognomic for the underlying disorder. So this is where the barriers of testing we can see at a basic clinical level or clinical and diagnostic level. Let's see how the government of India is working to help us out. If you look into Government of India is actively participating to help to support for the rare disorders, and Government of India has formed a national policy for treatment of rare diseases, which has been established in 2021. There is no specific definition of a rare disorders according to Government of India. However, what the policy tells is these are disorders as identified and categorized by experts based upon their clinical experience. So it's a slightly broad-based understanding what we are looking for. And there are various centers for excellence have been created across India. There are 12 centers for excellence which have been there. And there are sub-centers or Nidan Kendras which acts as a supervisory for some of the centers. What's the advantage? The Center for Excellence get a funding up to 5 crores in Indian rupees for putting up labs and clinical care. And patients can request up to 50 lakhs for funding for the treatments. This funding can come through various resources, even through crowdfunding, where this system helps to ease the mechanism for raising the funding for these disorders. However, when you look into this policy, issue is it's primarily directed towards inborn errors of metabolism, reflecting it's a primary contribution from pediatric groups. And what you see, if you can look into these disorders, they have divided the groups into disorders amenable to one-time curative treatment or disorders requiring long-term or lifelong treatment, and diseases for which definitive treatments are available, but challenges in optimal patient selection and very high cost of therapy are possible. When you look into this, there is no specific movement disorders are mentioned, probably except you can look as inborn errors of metabolism or groups where most of the patients may have movement disorders. Even you could be surprised that even there is no mention of Wilson disease in this policy. So forget about this. For all other adult onset rare movement disorders such as Huntington disease, atypical Parkinsonian syndromes, dystonias have no mention in this policy disorders. So why? Probably it's a lack of representation of movement disorder society in the policymakers. So we do require at this point of time the Movement Disorder Society of India advocacy group to reach out to the policymakers and have the representation so that proper rare movement disorders are reflected in the policy and support is created for that. So have we done anything for this? Saying off that it's not in the policy, whether nothing is moving forward. Not like that. Yes, things are being worked at a group level. The Movement Disorder Society of India and the Movement Disorder Specialists have formed groups where task forces have been formed, like the Wilson Disease Task Force, which has been a conglomeration of 3 different societies which have been involved in the care of Wilson disease. Then the formation of the genetics for young onset Parkinson disease cohort in 2017, the starting of the GWAS India Lux Giant project, or in the 2022 establishment of the pair PSP group registry. All these things show us that there are multiple different studies are occurring in relation to rare movement disorders, and studies are going forward in this perspective. And Not only that, they have already come up with different publications over a period of time. So what is required? What do we require for our immediate futures for rare movement disorders? We require three important things. One is advocacy, to create awareness, to reach out to government agencies, and to guide pharmaceutical and research agencies. We need to form study groups to understand current scenarios, to fine-tune our requirements, and to recognize rare movement disorders and various hotspots across India. Then finally, we need to form our registries for patient groups, which helps in collating a source point for patient advocacy, early and rapid recruitment for newer therapies. We should take few of the diseases as examples. I'm just giving the examples down here where we should be able to immediately implement these things. Either it can be form of advocacy, study groups, or registry. Among these, one most important is Wilson disease, which is well-established rare movement disorders with Indian hotspot, treatable disorders, where already some of the institutes are having registries, some study groups are there, some advocacies are there, which can be just been reflected to form into a proper national base. The issue is most of the centers, most of the zones are working independent of each other, and the cohesiveness to forming a single pan-India platform is lacking. That is where some of these are not taking the right step forward the way we would have expected it to go. This is where the whole cohort of the society or the movement disorder society will come into role. Finally, to remember, what I would like to tell is for the rare movement disorders in India is genetic testing is fairly available. Good clinical suspicion and workup intent is the primary goal for making a diagnosis. Proper infrastructure for evaluation for variants of unknown significance and omics studies will increase our strength to diagnose these rare movement disorders better. Some of the cost and treatment and better government support would help us better caring for these patients. Creation of advocacy by the Movement Disorder Society of India will have proper representation for these patients across India. And yes, everyone looks for therapeutic interventions. Some form of a therapeutic interventions would act as an impetus for many of these things to go forward. Thank you. Thanks a lot for your attention. If any questions are there, I'm ready to take further. Thank you.